Thank you, Ramiro, and thank you to the Tribunal for having me here, to the members, the Secretariat, for giving me the opportunity to make my presentation to tell us about the case of Ecuador and how the advocates of the rights of nature how our rights have been breached. We're also going to tell you more about this experience from the case of the Pachamama Foundation. Can you give us a specific idea of why the movements are going to be presenting are advocates of the rights of nature? My name is Belen Paez. As Ramiro said, I've been working at the Ecuadorian Amazonian forest for 20 years. I defend the rights of the Amazon forest and the jungles, and to defend the collective rights. The advocates of the rights of nature and rainforest have been exposed for the last 20 years in Ecuador to marginalization by each specific government. We have been attacked, we have been threatened, and we've suffered systematic our legitimacy has been challenged, and along with the indigenous movement, we have been protesting, not against, but in favor of the conservation of biodiversity in Ecuador, because there are oil and mining projects that will permanently affect these areas, which are highly diverse. This is what I can tell you about who we are, about a group of advocates for the rights of nature. Is a joint effort with NGOs and indigenous peoples who are the ones down there fighting for the rights of the Amazonia. And to talk about the specific cases of Ecuador, which is the Pachamama Foundation, the indigenous movement, could you tell us more about the extraction business going on in Ecuador, and why these movements are a threat to oil exploitation and mining? In the last few years, Ecuador has been in a permanent state of oil extraction, and currently is undergoing a lot of mining extraction. For over 40 years, groups, organizations, indigenous leaders have been exposed, and they've been out there and they've advocated for their rights, for their territories and their essential rights, and they've become vulnerable because the political project of the country is based on the fact that many forests and many indigenous peoples are suffering extractivism. This dependence by countries such as Ecuador, the fact that their economy depends on natural resources such as oil, has meant that this has been a very negative impact, and that's caused a lot of pain as well. It has affected a lot of indigenous populations, and they are endangered groups. To talk about fundamental rights, which protect us as advocates for human rights, in the Ecuadorian constitution, the fundamental right of association is enshrined in the constitution. We can choose to associate freely. And also, the rights to protest and the right to peaceful demonstration are also enshrined. Even though these two rights are enshrined in the Ecuadorian constitution, and even though Ecuador has signed international agreements to commit to observing these rights and make sure that people can come together freely and protest freely, unfortunately, over the last 9 years, the Ecuadorian government has chosen to create regulations, laws, and decrees that are in detriment to and that breach these rights discretionally. Even though the Constitution defends our rights as advocates of human rights, nowadays there are regulations that undermine our capacity, our ability, or our freedom to get together and protest. So, as an example, we can see the serious impact that this has had on the lives of several indigenous leaders. They've been criminalized, they've been sent to jail, and they have been even attacked physically. Also, NGOs, an NGO, which is Fundación Pachamama, was closed down. It was an organization that protected rainforests, and it also provided support before international and national courts. For example, as in the topic of Sarayaco in the courts of human rights, Pachamama was closed down after 17 years of working. This was through a ministerial order. The government of Ecuador decreed the dissolution of an NGO. This is despite the fact that the Constitution states the right to free association. So what does Pachamama mean? Pachamama is a Quechua word that refers to not only the earth and the relationship of the indigenous peoples with earth, but also the time, space, and everything that surrounds the universe. For us, Pachamama, Mother Earth, is a sacred element, a vital element, which is interconnected with the spiritual world, and to which we have dedicated all of our efforts in the last 18 years. Can you tell us what caused the Ecuadorian government to close down Pachamama, and also what the excuse was, what the justification was? The Pachamama Foundation was always providing support of organizational associations with Central and South Amazonian groups, the groups that have been protecting and defending the rights in view of the attacks from oil extraction. Each year, they mobilized from the rainforest to the city, Quito, so that they can confront the authorities and demand that the rights are fulfilled. 2 years ago, during one of the marches, which was led by the indigenous peoples movement, which is legitimately represented, some leaders went to the city of Quito, and during this peaceful demonstration, which had the prior concern and prior information, and some events took place which were taken as a justification to dissolve the Pachamama Foundation. So the people protesting to defend biodiversity, the rights of indigenous peoples and nature can now be easily attacked or their organizations dissolved through ministerial orders, as well as the statutes for which they were created. And the government can falsely accuse and carry out processes to dissolve us. And they did this because we support indigenous people so that they can protest and do so peacefully for their rights. So what were the implications of the closure of the Pachamama Foundation for the civil society and the movements of the rights of nature in Ecuador? Of course, there was an irreversible impact that took place. At the regional level, this shows the mistaken behavior of the Ecuadorian government very clearly, because they use these discretional regulations or decrees to dissolve organizations from the civil society. Closing the Pachamama Foundation became a historical precedent in the country. It's the first NGO that was closed down, an NGO that has been at the forefront and accompanying and supporting the protection of the rainforest in the Amazonia, and also the collective rights in Ecuador and in the region. The precedent in question has caused fear, concerns, and doubt for a lot of other organizations that are carrying out a similar task. In any case, in the last few years, we've seen that the government carried on harassing other organizations, has limiting their freedom of expression, particularly for organizations that have been advocating for human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and the rights of nature, and realize that they're not only attacking civil society movements and human rights movements, but also they're dividing movements for the rights of indigenous peoples, which will be spoken next. Before Nari speaks, can you tell us briefly, in the last minute you have, about the situation of women in the Amazon region? Movimiento por una Amazonia Viva. The movement of indigenous women, specifically those that have been on the border trying to defend their lives, their children, their forest, they have been very active. They've been at the forefront or in the first line to explain how the forest should be conserved, how there's a spiritual balance, how there's a balance to do with resources and the rights, how everything is a whole. And through their voices, they've reached not only local communities, but provinces and other communities elsewhere. And during a demonstration in 2015, in August, a series of violent events took place against women, particularly indigenous women, who had been protesting to advocate for the rights of nature. Many of them were beaten up, and including one, a well-known activist of over 60, was beaten up as well. And as a result, there were a series of violent acts against more than 20 women in all the different provinces. Many of them, as I said, were affected and attacked physically. And this women's movement for life and conservation of spaces, of rainforest spaces, was put down on a document that was presented in front of the Inter-American Tribunal, which is one of the last spaces that we, as the advocates for human rights, still have. It's not possible to achieve justice in our country, but there are still international means that we can use so that we can express our anguish, our fear, and our desires in spaces other than our countries, because in our country it's not possible to defend our rights. Thank you, Belen, for your testimony. I'd like to know exactly the role of the judiciary in these cases. We know that the executive tends to exert pressure on the criminalization of the advocates of human rights. But the judiciary, what's their position? The three powers in Ecuador have been dominated and controlled by one specific political party. So to sum up, this means that there's no independent judiciary in Ecuador right now. And even though the Constitution enshrines in Article 98, as well as others, the significance of fundamental rights to association and to resist and to peaceful protest in terms of courts and administrative action, or even actions that would promote fulfillment of rights, it is not possible to reach favorable results for advocates of human rights. Could you also explain to me about some of the people that have died? Perhaps there's some cases of assassinations. And the other question, could you tell us about the current situation? Thank you, Judge Atosa, for your question. In Ecuador, there are some reports that have also been published by the Inter-American courts about the criminalization of protest in Ecuador. There are hundreds of cases of people belonging to the indigenous movement or people that defend the rights of nature who have been criminalized and some of them are still in jail, even after protests and demonstrations that have been peaceful. Their cases have not been closed. A lot of them are still awaiting judgment or a decision so that they can leave the jail and freely have a free life. There's no explanation from the state, specifically Shuar, indigenous peoples, people that have been working for citizen groups to defend their territories from mining. And there's been several cases of offences being committed, things that have not been resolved or clarified by the state against advocates of human rights, of nature's rights. Also, there's harassment and attacks. There's military intelligence reports, even regarding some people on this panel from the Secretariat, people that are actively advocating for the rights of nature in Ecuador and globally. We are being investigated by military and other authorities. There's a lot of pressure and lots of surveillance, checking who is around us, what our network is, who our donors are, how we carry out our work, how we relate with each other. And this seems to be a pattern. The government seems to be surveilling absolutely every single step that we take. So there's a lot of physical and mental harassment against us. Last question by Judge Alberto. I would like to ask for clarification. I would like to make a remark as well. For the colleagues on the panel at the Tribunal, it would be good to see what the specific actions and projects of the Pachamama Foundation that worked in Ecuador for 16 years, that was in favor of the protection of forests and the rights of indigenous groups and also organizational processes. But I'd like to know as well, what are the specific projects were there in terms of transport, care for women and other actions? Because it seems that the foundation was only dedicated to the rights to defend the advocating of rights. Of course, that's allowed in Ecuador, at least on paper. In practice, we know that, and this is my remark, even though Ecuador has a very avant-garde constitution, including the rights of nature being enshrined and the nature as a subject of rights, and the prohibition of the privatization of water because it's a fundamental human right, and the expansion of collective rights, and, for example, rights to do with buen vivir, good living, but things are not being fulfilled. There's something that we cannot forget to mention. Extractivism, per se, is violent. Mining, oil, agrarian, and any other extractivist practices are violent, and they cause social protest to be criminalized, regardless of what the Constitution enshrines, whether it's Article 98, where there's the right to resistance, and Article 95, the right to action, association, and participation in political rights are enshrined. What I would like to know is if you can expand a little bit upon what I've said, but specifically the specific projects that the Pachamama Foundation carried out. Thank you, Alberto, for your clarification. I'd like to tell you that over the last 16 years, the Pachamama Foundation, which was illegally closed down in 2013 by the government of Ecuador, worked on several fields that were not only dedicated to strengthening collective rights and protecting the most biodiverse forests in the world, but also, and jointly with the local communities, to carry out alternative projects so that they could strengthen their cultural aspects and also to improve the level of collaboration between them. Several projects were nominated and classed as major projects in the region, such as ecotourism, projects that have to do with mother-child health, women empowering in local communities, and also rethinking a solidarity economy, which is still being implemented in some communities. These projects were applied in Amazonia, but we have also expanded on affecting public policy. One of our actions in collaboration with other people is that we discuss the rights of nature and how we can incorporate these fundamental rights, the nature of nature, to the Ecuadorian constitution, the permanent subject of training on collective rights for indigenous peoples, but also cultural integrity, how to prevail and how they can keep up this balance with nature and their dreams through their culture, which these are now our dreams too. It's always been a pleasure to work for Amazonia. And here, each one of us, each one of the members on this tribunal, we have put absolutely everything, our hearts and souls, into advocating for the rights of nature, the rights of the indigenous people that live on those territories. And this is a wonderful space created from this perspective. So it's a very moving thing for me to be here. I'm very grateful to each one of the judges.
Thank you very much for your dedication and long-time work and all that you have done over the last years. There's a Global Witness report that has, they do a report every year, but the most recent one says that there's really a deadly trend in the death of defenders of the land, that there's been a 20% increase from those documented in 2013, that there's been this increase. And I wondered if you could comment on this relationship between the fact that a lot of those defenders of the land are the ones who are protecting the forests. They're the ones who are protecting the rivers. They're the ones who are actually defending the land for all of us in terms of stopping environmental degradation. And how does this fit into a violation against rights of nature, very locally, as you have poignantly stated, but also so that we understand that this is all of our problem?
We all need to understand here that this criminalization of the advocates of the rights of nature, we need to understand that within this context and within this situation is all linked with extractivism, with abuse, with consumerism, with the overuse of our resources, with the extraction of oil and other resources to resolve our energy needs. These are directly linked with the violation of rights. We have the development of for example, on the one hand, we have a violation to do with reuse of resources and also with people that live on these territories where these resources are and the people that support these processes to defend the rights of everybody, both men and women. So there's a direct relationship in this respect. Thank you very much, Maria Belen.